The lobby of Horizon Bank gleamed with polished marble and muted whispers until one sentence cut through like glass. Your withdrawal's denied. Margaret Clean, the branch manager, didn't just say it. She snapped it. Her voice was sharp, dismissive, final, aimed at Eleanor Harris, a 67-year-old black woman standing with quiet grace beneath a chandelier she personally approved during the branch's renovation. Her ID was on the counter. Her account was valid. But none of that seemed to matter. Across the lobby, a suited man chuckled. "She's not one of us." Another teller leaned in, whispered possible fraud, and printed a receipt stamped suspicious. Phones tapped impatiently. Customers grumbled about delays. But Eleanor didn't flinch. She looked directly at Margaret and said, "You'll answer for this." No one knew. Not Margaret, not Tara behind the glass, not Preston in his pinstripe arrogance. None of them realized they were shaming the very woman who led the bank's national expansion strategy. The woman who could, in just 7 minutes, undo every assumption they clung to. They thought they were denying a stranger. They were about to be fired by their CEO. If you believe in justice, hit that like button and subscribe for more real-life stories that expose the truth. The polished tile beneath Eleanor Harris's low-heel boots reflected the fluorescent ceiling like a cold mirror. She stood still, unmoving, unflinching, while the world around her cracked into a theater of silent betrayal. The receipt marked suspicious trembled in her hand, its red lettering bolder than any slur. Behind the counter, Tara Leditz turned back to her monitor, whispering again to the teller beside her. She's stalling, probably hoping someone will vouch for her. Her voice was laced with sarcasm, but loud enough to carry. Eleanor could hear every word, every implied insult. Margaret Clean crossed her arms and leaned against the partition as if watching a child about to be scolded. "You need to step aside, ma'am, or I'll have to escalate." She didn't say it with authority. She said it with irritation. Eleanor breathed in slowly, holding the air in her chest like a shield. She had heard that tone before at fund allocation meetings where her competence was second-guessed during shareholder summits where her contributions were misattributed. But this was different. This wasn't doubt. This was dismissal. Complete, unfiltered, racialized dismissal. The lobby echoed with the quiet shuffle of disapproval. A man in a windbreaker sighed. "I just need to deposit my check," he muttered to his wife. "Can't believe we're stuck behind this drama." Another woman clutched her handbag and whispered to her teenage daughter, "It's always something." Still, Eleanor didn't speak, her fingers adorned with a single gold ring pressed gently on her purse strap. No flinch, no twitch, just breath, just poise. Tara returned to her keyboard and typed rapidly. A ping sounded, followed by a faint blinking alert on her screen. "Looks like her account's on watch," she said. Margaret stepped closer to read over her shoulder, then smirked. "Figure," she muttered. The words weren't just insulting. They were rehearsed an entire performance of arrogance wearing the costume of policy. Eleanor had written half the policies these women misquoted. But none of that mattered here, not to them, not yet. Across the room, Preston Ward adjusted his blazer with theatrical flair. "Some people just don't understand boundaries," he said loudly. "This isn't a check-cashing shack. It's a bank for professionals." Eleanor glanced his way, but only briefly. She'd met 100 Prestons in her life, men who mistook inheritance for intellect and status for superiority. She could write a thesis on his archetype, but she didn't. Not today. Lydia Grant, the senior teller, seated 3 desks down, watched everything. She didn't speak. Not yet. But her hands froze above the keyboard. Her heart pounded in her chest. She recognized the woman standing at the counter. Not from a client list, not from training videos, but from the quiet reverence passed between older staff. They called her the architect, the one who fought for maternity benefits in branch-level HR, the one who introduced transparency dashboards, the one who stayed in the storm when others had quit. Now she stood under judgment, in silence, in public. Eleanor adjusted the collar of her coat. Her eyes locked briefly with Lydia's, and something unspoken passed between them. A whisper without words. A weight Lydia couldn't ignore. In the far corner, Marcus Tate, the security chief, leaned against the frame of the camera station. His posture was casual, but his eyes were sharp. He had noticed the murmurs, the body language, the smug grins. He recognized the pattern. Not just prejudice, but systemic repetition. And still Eleanor said nothing. Atop the teller counter, the receipt Tara had printed still fluttered in the breeze from a nearby vent. Suspicious. It mocked her silently. Eleanor picked it up, folded it neatly, and slipped it into her purse. "I'll wait," she said. Calm, steady. Margaret raised an eyebrow. "Wait for what approval from someone who doesn't exist?" The sarcasm laced every syllable. "No," Eleanor replied, "just watching." The silence deepened. A customer behind her scoffed, "Well, I hope she's watching the exit." Another customer chimed in, "This is a waste of everyone's time." None of it moved her, because Eleanor knew something no one else in the room had caught yet. She wasn't trapped in their story. They were walking blind into hers, and they'd written themselves into the wrong roles, villains disguised as rule followers, accomplices draped in policy. She was timing every second. She was logging every insult. And she wasn't alone. In the HR office 3 cities away, Nina Patel was watching the branch's live flagging dashboard. A red alert had triggered suspicious activity submitted on a flagged account. It was an internal tool only a few executives had access to. Eleanor had built it herself. Nina's eyebrows rose as she saw the name E. Harris, Chicago main branch. Her fingers flew across the keyboard. Back at the branch, Eleanor finally turned to face the growing crowd. Not angry, not embarrassed, but utterly composed. "I won't be long," she said softly. Preston laughed. "You already have been." Eleanor didn't reply. But the silence she wore was louder than anything spoken in that room. And it was about to break everything. Eleanor didn't flinch when Margaret called security. She didn't argue when Tara printed another receipt stamped "Access Denied." And when Kenneth Doyle whispered, "She's stalling," to cause a scene loud enough for 3 nearby customers to nod in quiet agreement, she only blinked once. Slowly, as if to say, "You just made your last mistake." The silence surrounding Eleanor wasn't passive, it was calculating. She stood not like someone without options, but like someone choosing not to use them yet. The monitor behind the counter refreshed. Tara leaned in, frowning. A second red flag had appeared labeled "Client Escalation Threat, Level Orange." It was a classification Horizon's system reserved for disruptive behavior, the kind of data point later used to justify denials and removals. What Tara didn't know was that Eleanor had helped design that system line by line, definition by definition. And what none of them knew was that every input they were feeding, every keystroke, every fabricated flag, was syncing in real time with Horizon's executive oversight dashboard, a dashboard Eleanor still had admin rights to. From a quiet corner behind the information kiosk, a small sound chimed from a smartwatch Marcus Tate's. The former police captain, turned head of security, tapped his screen and read the update. "Executive alert E. Harris potential protocol breach at Chicago, Maine." He tapped a coded response, just 2 letters seen. Marcus didn't move, not yet, but the game board had changed. Back upstairs, 2 floors above the frigid lobby, Raymond Holt stared at his phone. The chairman of Horizon Bank had just received a brief message from Claire Evans. "She's downstairs. They don't know it's her. And they're about to make it worse." He stood slowly from the long walnut table in the executive conference room. "Cancel my next call," he told his assistant, "and prep legal." Down in the lobby, the emotional temperature shifted. Tara whispered to Margaret again, "Should I call the hotline," referring to the internal fraud prevention team? Margaret nodded curtly, still not looking directly at Eleanor. "Flag the account and note refusal to comply." Behind the counter, Lydia Grant bit her tongue. Her fingers hovered over the keys, but she didn't type. She'd worked at this branch longer than anyone else on staff. She remembered when Eleanor Harris was just a name in strategy memos, a rising star in executive updates. But standing in front of her now was no memo. It was the architect herself. Lydia leaned sideways and tapped a series of commands into her terminal. It opened a hidden interface. She had never used it before, only read about it in compliance briefings. A 5-digit code, Eleanor's legacy override ID, was still active. She typed it. Administrator access. Harris, Eleanor M. Role CEO. Status active. Lydia froze, her breath hitched. The woman standing at the counter wasn't just a powerful black executive. She was the black executive who saved Horizon during the 2008 crash, who refused the federal bailout, who turned the bank from predatory to community-based, who implemented the client dignity charter, still engraved on the branch plaque no one had read in years. And Tara had just called her suspicious. Lydia glanced up. Eleanor met her eyes again, calm and unwavering. Lydia stood. "I'll be right back," she said to no one in particular. She stepped into the operations hallway, pulled out her phone, and called Clara Evans. "She's here," Lydia said, "and they're burying themselves." Clara didn't ask for clarification. "Put your earpiece in. I'll stay on." At the same moment, Nina Patel, still seated at Horizon's HR headquarters, watched in disbelief as Margaret Clean filed a formal fraud report on the CEO's account. Her mouth went dry. She opened a live chat with Clara. Nina, fraud report just filed against Eleanor. Clara, pull her personnel file. Flag all involved. Nina, already done. Margaret, Tara, Kenneth. Preston's a client, but he's involved too. Preston Ward, oblivious to the hurricane forming around him, was still trying to impress the watching crowd. I've seen this before, he said loudly, gesturing toward Eleanor. Fake withdrawals, card switches, the whole act. She thinks no one's paying attention. Eleanor turned her head slightly toward him. She said nothing. But her silence wasn't maud emptiness. It was loaded with history. With every moment she'd been talked over in boardrooms. With every condescending ma'am from bankers half her age. With every headline that questioned whether a black woman could lead a bank, and every quarterly report that proved them wrong. And now with every second, Preston kept talking, he was scripting his own downfall. Tara returned with another printed document. Client account privileges revoked pending fraud investigation, it read. She held it up like a trophy. Eleanor reached for her phone again. No drama, no performance. She tapped a single icon. A custom app developed internally for executive crisis response. Her thumbprint activated the protocol. The bank's internal systems lit up. A red circle appeared in the corner of every teller screen. Margaret squinted at hers. Override request from who? Her voice trailed off as the name appeared. Initiated by Harris Eleanor M. Title Chief Executive Officer. Location branch lobby. Margaret's jaw tightened. Kenneth turned pale. Tara dropped her pen. But Eleanor, she didn't move. She let the silence do what no argument ever could: expose the imbalance. She wasn't here to explain herself. She was here to remind them who she was. And that reminder was about to go public. The moment Eleanor's override swept through the branch's system, a dozen silent fractures within Horizon's internal culture cracked wide open. Teller terminals froze. Access dashboards glitched. A system-level alert triggered an emergency compliance audit, automatically opening the branch's entire transaction log for the past 72 hours to legal age and executive oversight. Margaret Clean stared at her screen, watching it collapse into lines of error code and blinking red text. Tara's mouth hung open as her terminal auto-logged her out, replacing her dashboard with a blunt message: access suspended pending review. But this wasn't just about terminals. This was about years of arrogance calcified into policy. Eleanor knew it. Clara knew it. Raymond Holt had warned about it in board meetings, though no one had wanted to see the truth so plainly. Horizon Bank had slowly become a castle of assumptions, gilded, insulated, and rotting from within. And today its foundation had just been struck by its own architect. Upstairs, Clara Evans minimized the open footage streaming from the lobby and opened a folder she'd been dreading for months. Bias incident logs, unreviewed. She skimmed quickly. March 4th. Elderly Latina client misidentified as non-primary user. May 16th, Nigerian doctor questioned about the legitimacy of his wire transfer. June 21st, Sikh man escorted out after staff claimed his turban made others nervous. Each case tagged with the familiar name, T. Lettids or M. Clean. Sometimes both. Most were closed with canned summaries: client non-compliant, verification incomplete, escalated for safety. There were 57 in total. Clara's chest tightened. She forwarded the folder to Nina Patel. Subject: systemic rot confirmed. Begin formal classification. Back in the lobby, Preston Ward still hadn't realized the full scope of what he'd walked into. This bank used to stand for standards, he boomed, stepping closer to the teller line. Not social experiments. Preston Marcus Tate's voice finally cut through the rising noise. Step back. The retired officer's tone held the kind of calm that preceded consequences. Preston blinked, but didn't argue. Maybe it was the security badge clipped to Marcus's coat. Maybe it was the look in his eye one that said, "You're already on record." Tara leaned toward Kenneth, her voice now a whisper. What do we do? Kenneth didn't respond. He stared at the screen as his access too disappeared in real time. Behind Eleanor, Lydia Grant remained steady, watching everything unfold with the kind of clarity that only time could give. She had seen bias before, subtle, deflected, and systemic. But never had it been exposed this completely, this quickly, and from the top. She turned to Eleanor. They don't understand what just happened, she said quietly. Eleanor nodded. They will. From his remote login in HR headquarters, Raymond Holt finished skimming Margaret's personnel file. 3 formal complaints, 2 client escalations swept under the rug. One internal investigation derailed by a former supervisor who'd retired months ago. All of it was damning. Time to clean house, he muttered. He called Nina Patel. Start pulling training compliance records. Every skipped module, every flag session. I want a branch-by-branch heat map before the board meets tonight. Nina was already on it. Meanwhile, Clara picked up the internal hotline and connected directly to the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau liaison assigned to Horizon. She spoke fast, clear, and without hesitation. We've had a breakdown of equity enforcement in a flagship location. Internal footage confirms staff negligence and racial profiling of our CEO during a personal transaction. She paused. Yes, she stayed calm. No, she didn't reveal her identity until necessary. Yes, we've initiated Section 7 of our Executive Crisis Protocol. The reckoning has begun. In the lobby, the reckoning was already tangible. A customer who had quietly filmed the entire event was now uploading it to YouTube. Another had gone live on Instagram. The title read, CEO treated like a fraud at her own bank. Within 4 minutes, the video had over 30,000 views. Preston noticed, his face paled. He backed away toward the door, but stumbled slightly. No one helped him. A woman near the check deposit kiosk whispered to her friend, "We judged her, and we were wrong." Eleanor took a breath. Then she stepped forward, right to the center of the lobby, and typed a short command into the main kiosk touchscreen. The monitor behind her flickered. Then it loaded something unfamiliar to most of the staff Horizon's client dignity charter. The words on screen read, "Every individual, regardless of age, race, appearance, or assumed status, is entitled to full service, full respect, and full voice." Revised by Eleanor M. Harris, 2010. Tara's eyes widened. Kenneth whispered, "She wrote that?" Eleanor turned toward them. "Yes," she said. "You all work under rules I crafted to protect people from the very behavior you just displayed. And now every word is being held up against your actions." Marcus stepped forward beside her and added, "And the cameras are still rolling." Across the bank's internal Slack system, a notification pinged branch 004. Incident escalated to Class A. CEO involved. Compliance audit in progress. Executives across Horizon's national offices began noticing. Screenshots of the live stream started circulating. Hashtags emerged. CEO, while Black Bank bias, exposed Horizon truth. What had started as a silent humiliation was now a national scandal waiting to unfold. But Eleanor wasn't after headlines. She was after the truth codified, undeniable, institutional. And the rot that had taken root in her bank, it was being carved out, one terminal, one policy, one lie at a time. The lobby was no longer a waiting area. It was a courtroom without a judge, a classroom without a blackboard, and a stage on which people discovered often too late who they really were. And somewhere between the embarrassed silence of the staff and the shifting stares of customers, a few individuals began to see the truth. Lydia Grant had worked at Horizon for 18 years. She'd trained tellers, balanced vaults, and seen policies come and go like weather fronts. But never had she seen what she saw today, power wielded not as threat, but as mirror. And what stared back at the staff, at herself, was uncomfortable. She stood taller at her station, letting her braided silver hair rest neatly against her collar as she glanced toward the screen, now displaying the Client Dignity Charter. It was a document many dismissed, printed on laminated cards no one read, but now it pulsed like a siren above the teller line. From behind the loan desk, Eric Nguyen, a financial consultant barely 2 years into his Horizon career, pulled off his headset. He'd spent the past 15 minutes frozen, first in confusion, then disbelief, and now shame. When he was onboarded, no one mentioned a CEO who looked like Eleanor Harris. No one mentioned how she had rebuilt the institution after the 2008 crash. They spoke of founding vision, but never said her name. He walked toward the back room, heart racing. Near the glass entryway, a mother clutching her 8-year-old son's hand leaned close and whispered, "You see her. That's leadership." Her son, eyes wide, nodded slowly. At the far side of the lobby, seated quietly in one of the armchairs meant for loan applicants, sat a man named Andre Belson. He wore a janitor's uniform under his winter coat. He came in weekly to cash his check. Usually ignored, usually invisible, but not today. He stood up, walked forward, and did something no one expected. He clapped once slowly, then again. The sound was startling in the silence. Then someone else joined, a young woman in a denim jacket, then another, an elderly man with a cane. 3 people, then 5, then half the room. No one shouted. No one cheered. They just stood and clapped for the truth. Tara's hands curled against her sides. "This is ridiculous," she muttered, eyes darting for support. But Kenneth Doyle wasn't speaking anymore. He looked at the ground, jaw clenched. Margaret's eyes shimmered, though whether from rage or regret, no one could tell. At that moment, Eric reappeared from the back room with a stack of folders in his arms. He walked straight to Lydia and whispered, "These are internal complaints from this branch. A lot were buried. I checked the archive after she typed in that code." Lydia looked at him. "How many, Mom?" 17, he said, half tagged with Tara's name, 3 with Kenneth's signature. Lydia's face darkened. She turned toward Eleanor. "Miss Harris," she called gently, "we have more." Eleanor raised an eyebrow but said nothing. She reached out and took the folders as Lydia approached. At the same time, Clara Evans' voice piped in again through the branch phone's speaker system. "I just spoke with Raymond. He wants you to proceed, Eleanor. Full transparency. Open review." Eleanor nodded. She walked to the front counter, placed the folders on it like legal exhibits, and opened the top one. It detailed an incident where a 19-year-old black college student was denied a loan consultation on the grounds of insufficient identification, despite having both a passport and student ID. Signed by Tara, approved by Kenneth. A quiet gasp echoed. Then the next file, a Latina single mother whose overdraft charges had been reinstated without notification. Another, an Indian immigrant, told his savings account would be simpler to manage if closed and transferred to cash. Margaret's initials were on all of them. "Why didn't we know?" Eric whispered to Lydia. "You did," she said quietly. "You just didn't look." Behind the teller line, another junior employee, Mel, barely 22, and new to the branch, stood watching. She had grown up hearing stories of redlining and banking discrimination. But she thought those were relics of the past lessons in textbooks, not the present. But today wasn't history. It was happening right in front of her. She stepped forward and whispered to Marcus, "Do we file a witness report?" Marcus gave her a look, not harsh, not soft, but approving. "Yes," he said, "today you do." From his seat behind the counter, Preston Ward shifted uneasily, the weight of stares finally registering. No one saw him as a lead anymore. No one nodded with him. He was just another man caught in the act of clinging to a false sense of supremacy. He stood to leave, but Eleanor's voice stopped him. "You should stay," she said calmly. "You might learn something." He hesitated, then sat again. Eleanor turned back to the crowd. "This isn't about punishing people," she said. "It's about showing the system what it let grow in silence." And one by one, that silence was ending. Mel filed the witness report. Eric opened his laptop and began cross-referencing complaint logs. Lydia stood beside Eleanor, no longer in the background. And in that moment, the culture of Horizon Bank, at least in this branch, began to shift. Not because of policy, but because people finally saw, and they could never unsee it again. Eleanor Harris didn't need to raise her voice. The room had done that for her. Now came the part most people missed, the part where consequences weren't just demanded, but documented. And she was ready. "Marcus," she said, her voice even, "secure the footage." The former police captain nodded, already tapping into the security panel near the side door. Hidden mics, lobby feeds, teller, audio logs. He'd quietly activated a redundant archive system earlier when the shouting began. Now he downloaded every angle to a secure external drive. Lydia leaned over the counter and offered, "Do you want access logs too? I can run a trace on who filed those fake flags." Eleanor nodded. "Yes, everything. Internal messages, timestamps, logins." Behind them, Mel was copying the customer complaint records Eric had just pulled from archives. She held her breath as the ancient HP printer buzzed and spat out each flagged file, one after another. 17 in all. They weren't just paper anymore. They were patterns. Meanwhile, Nina Patel from HR patched into the system from HQ. "I'm inside now," she announced through the speakerphone on Marcus's desk. "Reviewing all fraud flags submitted by Tara Leeds over the past 6 months. I've found 11 that match Eleanor's case identical language." Eleanor raised an eyebrow. "All false?" "Not one verified," Nina confirmed. Eric swallowed hard. "Should I notify legal?" "You already did," Clara Evans replied through the boardroom line. "We've got a compliance officer en route. Estimated arrival 22 minutes. While Tara remained frozen in place, Kenneth shifted behind the glass office door, watching the data move faster than excuses. Eleanor took the top folder file. 1. Do we have a fraud audit trail for this? Yes, Nina replied. Printing now from HQ and syncing to the branch network. Just then, the overhead screen flickered again. Lydia had opened a diagnostic log of all suspicious activity reports, color-coded by origin, red for Tara, yellow for Kenneth, purple for Margaret. The screen filled with red. Total filed from this branch, Lydia narrated in the last calendar year 81. Filed from the top performing branch downtown, 19. A gasp. Preston Ward stood again now sweating. Are you trying to say this is systemic? It's just a few clerks gone rogue. Claire answered first. Preston, you need to stop talking. Mel handed another folder to Eleanor. This one really hurt. It was a complaint from a deaf customer. The teller had mocked his signing, misinterpreted his transaction, and filed a fraud flag when he became visibly distressed. The teller, Tara Leeds. The approving manager, Margaret Clean. Eleanor looked up. And did anyone in management respond to this? Nina's voice came cold and clear. No, it was dismissed as communication error. From his place at the lobby entrance, Marcus turned slightly. We're going to need body language logs too. You're on camera every shift, he reminded the staff. And so are the clients. Tara's eyes widened. You can't use that. I can, Marcus said, especially when it proves you escalated situations that were calm. Eleanor turned to Kenneth. You had the authority to escalate this to corporate. Why didn't you? Kenneth bristled. Because they were minor issues. Minor. Eleanor stepped forward. Let me read from the file. She opened a page and read aloud, client of Indian descent misidentified as another flagged customer. Denied service for 3 weeks despite repeated verification attempts. When client brought their attorney, Kenneth Doyle responded, mistakes happen, but we have procedures. Did you say that she asked? Kenneth's silence said everything. The screen behind them flickered again. Lydia had pulled up a heat map of complaint resolutions. 68% marked closed without action. 79% closed within 1 hour. 92% without customer callback. Clara's voice broke through again. It's not just misconduct, it's suppression. Eleanor held up her phone. Nina started an internal hold on all personnel data from this branch. Nothing leaves, no one erases anything. No digital cleanup. We need this whole story preserved. Nina didn't hesitate. Lockdown in progress. Remote triggers enabled. Then Marcus stepped forward. There's more, he said. He opened a drawer at the security station and pulled out a small thumb drive. I made this backup after hearing Kenneth say, and I quote, older black clients trigger more red flags. That's just how the metrics look. A hush settled over the room. You recorded that, Eleanor asked. I did. I've also got audio of Tara saying, we don't serve just anyone in here. And Preston telling Kenneth, she's just another community case looking for a handout. Eric covered his mouth. Mel blinked rapidly. A woman near the back sat down slowly as if the air had thickened around her. Eleanor took the drive. Send a copy to Clara and Nina, and keep one offline. Marcus nodded. Already done. As the pieces fell into place, something else happened. Customers started standing. One woman approached the counter. How can I file my own statement? I've been ignored here for years. Lydia handed her a form. Then a second man stepped forward. I want to write down what I saw today. Write it, Eleanor said. We'll keep everyone. By the time the compliance officer arrived, the bank lobby had transformed. Folders on every desk. Screens glowing with evidence. Employees copying files instead of excuses. Witnesses volunteering statements. Eleanor didn't smile, but her eyes were steady, because truth wasn't loud. It was methodical, and in the hands of the right people, it was undeniable. Eleanor Harris stood at the center of the chaos she had not asked for, but had always been ready to command. With every whisper, every form printed, and every statement documented, the weight of her preparation began shifting the balance of power. Now it was time to act, not emotionally, not impulsively, but with strategy. She tapped the side of her phone and opened a private app internal to Horizon Bank leadership. At the top of the screen, Crisis Response Toolkit, Tier 2 activation. She didn't need Tier 3, not yet. She selected 3 options: compliance audit, trigger public integrity statement, and emergency HR freeze. Seconds later, a secure message pinged across the branch system. A red icon flashed in the corner of every teller's monitor. Kenneth's eyes narrowed when he saw it. Tara instinctively minimized her screen, but it was too late. The system had already initiated a branch-wide lock on edits, user deletions, and transaction flags. From upstairs, Clara Evans sent a quiet message through the board line, Crisis Tier 2 confirmed. You have full discretion. Eleanor turned to Marcus. Call in the Community Banking Council. He gave a short nod. Already looping them. They'll be here in 20. That wasn't a public relations team. It was a small task force of retired judges, civil rights lawyers, and ethics experts who partnered with Horizon to oversee fair service practices. Eleanor herself had founded the group 6 years ago. They didn't wear suits. They wore community credibility like armor. Meanwhile, Lydia moved quietly across the back office and opened the fireproof compliance drawer. Inside were 3 black binders, client risk profiles, escalation procedures, and internal red flags. She placed all 3 on the central desk. "May I?" she asked Eleanor. Eleanor nodded once. Lydia opened the escalation procedures binder and flipped directly to the signature logs. Her finger landed on a line signed repeatedly by Kenneth Doyle. "All these were advanced without second review," she said, "even though protocol mandates dual authorization." Tara flinched. "We didn't have time." "You had time to invent narratives," Eleanor interrupted. "You had time to code bias into every action, but not to verify." Mel walked to the printer and handed Eleanor a fresh report. "This is Tara's behavioral audit from her last training. She scored a 42. Passing was 75. Eric, voice low but steady, added, "She argued every prompt. Claimed bias training was for PR." Behind the teller line, Preston Ward finally seemed to understand something dangerous was happening. He straightened his tie, glanced at the phone in his hand, then typed a quick message to someone. Eleanor caught it. She raised her voice just slightly, not in anger, but in authority. "Preston, if you're contacting press, I suggest you include the part where you called a woman not one of us in a public space. We'll be releasing the full video footage." He paused mid-gesture. "You wouldn't." "We already are," Marcus said. Eric turned his monitor. On it played the raw video feed from earlier, Margaret denying the ID, Tara mocking the request, Kenneth voiding the transaction without a glance. Preston's hands dropped to his sides. But Eleanor didn't stop there. She pulled out her laptop and opened a file labeled Project Transparency. It was her private plan to restructure Horizon's equity protocols scheduled for next quarter. But plans change. She plugged the laptop into the lobby's projector. The screen behind the teller counter flickered again, revealing a blueprint of the future. Effective immediately, she said, "We are launching a beta version of Horizon's equity realignment dashboard. Every client complaint from the last 12 months will be re-reviewed by an independent equity committee." Gasps rippled through the lobby. "Branches that fail basic bias audits will lose executive bonuses," she continued. "Teller behavior will be ranked not just on sales, but respect. Internal bias flags will now be visible to every member of the board." Even Kenneth inhaled sharply. "That's never been done." "That's exactly why it's being done now." From her purse, Eleanor pulled out a stack of sealed envelopes prepared weeks ago, held until the moment called for them. She handed one to Marcus. "Give this to the local NAACP chapter." Another to Lydia. "This one goes to our community advisory board." And the last one she handed to Mel. "This one's for our media response team. Open if anyone leaks a version that excludes our truth." Mel stared at the envelope, then clutched it to her chest. Eleanor Clara's voice rang from the speaker again. "I've just received confirmation. The board's Shadow Equity Committee has been watching the footage live. They're offering you full authority to execute Tier 3 protocols if necessary." "I won't need Tier 3, Eleanor said calmly. "Why not?" "Because Dignity is already doing the work." She turned toward the lobby crowd. "We're not here to make a scene. We're here to make a system better. And that begins now with every document, every audit, every witness who speaks up." The crowd stood silent, but the shift had already begun. Phones remained up. But for the first time, so did heads. A woman clutched her purse tighter, not in fear, but solidarity. A teenage boy in a school hoodie nodded toward Eleanor with quiet awe. One of the junior tellers leaned against the counter, biting her lip, not out of resistance, but realization. Truth had entered the room, and now justice was walking right behind it. Margaret Clean stood frozen. The woman she'd dismissed 10 minutes ago as unverified now stood in front of her as the most powerful person in the building. Her skin drained of color, her spine locked rigid. She clutched the edge of the teller counter as if it might somehow protect her from the fallout that was no longer theoretical, it had begun. Eleanor Harris didn't move with theatrics. She stepped forward with the same quiet, measured grace that had unnerved dictators in boardrooms and bankers in backrooms. The hush in the lobby now wasn't passive, it was electric. Cameras remained up, but so did expectations. "Tara," Eleanor said, her voice crisp, "you printed and issued a suspicious activity report on an account that was fully verified, then publicly accused me of fraud without a second-tier review. That is a federal violation, and you know it." Tara swallowed. I followed procedure." "No, you followed your bias, and you used the system to justify it." Tara's voice cracked. "But I didn't know who you were." That's not a defense, Eleanor replied. That's the indictment. Kenneth took a step forward, gesturing to the staff as if trying to reclaim control. Okay, let's just calm down. We're in the middle of the day. There are clients present. This isn't the time. It is exactly the time, Eleanor said, turning her gaze on him. Because you said nothing when your team labeled me a fraud. You said nothing when Tara flagged my account. You only spoke up when your authority was questioned. Kenneth's jaw tensed. This is a miscommunication. Eleanor held up the fabricated report. Does this look like a miscommunication? Lydia stepped forward beside her, and this she added, holding up a printout of Kenneth's approval of Tara's report was signed within 90 seconds of her submission. You didn't even check the ID logs. I didn't think Kenneth began. No, Eleanor interrupted. You didn't. That's the problem. You acted as if my presence was the issue. You saw a black woman asking for her own money and assumed she was the threat. Behind her, the monitor still displayed employee compliance stats. Margaret's name glowed red at the top. She finally broke the silence. I've made mistakes, she said, barely audible. Eleanor looked at her. You made a decision. Repeatedly. A mistake is a wrong number. You submitted 4 falsified reports in 12 months, each one targeting non-white clients. Clara Evans' voice cut in from the speaker. And you lied to internal auditors. That alone is cause for termination. Margaret looked like she might collapse. Preston, still hovering on the periphery like a rotting shadow, stepped in once again. Are we really going to tear down this entire staff because of one overreaction? You people always. Eleanor turned to him. Finish that sentence, I dare you. Preston blinked. You mean women like me, she continued, or people who don't look like you? You've sat in this lobby for years and poisoned the air with your entitlement. No more. Your VIP status has been revoked. Permanently. Preston, step back. You don't have that authority. I am the authority. A ripple of gasps filled the room. It was the tone, not just the words, like the sound of a courtroom gavel or a final verdict read aloud. Final. Inarguable. Marcus stepped forward now, standing beside Eleanor. There's more, he said, lifting a file. Security footage. Kenneth ordered 2 black clients to be shadowed last week. No cause, just metrics. He handed the footage summary to Eleanor. Tara's voice rose in panic. We were told to monitor anomalies. Are black clients anomalies to you? Eleanor asked. Tara didn't answer. She couldn't. Just then the front door opened and 3 people stepped inside. None wore suits, but each carried a badge. Community Banking Council. Eleanor stepped aside, allowing them through. One of them, a woman in her 60s wearing a silver scarf, looked around the room. We've been watching the live feed, she said. It's bad, and it's real. Eleanor turned to face the room. For those wondering what happens now, let me make it clear. She pulled out a set of prepared notices. Margaret Clean, she said, turning to the manager. You are suspended pending termination procedures. You'll receive documentation within the hour. Margaret didn't move. Kenneth Doyle, Eleanor continued, you're removed from all decision-making roles immediately. Final status will be determined after retraining review. Kenneth exhaled like something had hit him in the chest. Tara Letted's your system access is revoked. You are to undergo mandatory reform training if you wish to retain your position in any capacity. Tara blinked rapidly, her mouth opening, then closing. Eleanor wasn't finished. To every client who watched this happen, this isn't how Horizon Bank operates. This is how it used to operate under shadows we tolerated too long. Then she turned, addressing the cameras directly. We're not covering this up. We're cleaning it out. A woman in the back clapped once, then another. The sound spread, not applause for spectacle, but for truth finally being spoken aloud. The reporter lowered his mic. He didn't need to ask anything more. The story was writing itself. And Eleanor Harris, Black 67, underestimated and unbothered, had just dismantled the lie of elite banking in a single undeniable confrontation. The next morning, Horizon Bank didn't open on time. At 8:00 a.m., clients across the city stared at glass doors that remained locked. Signs on each branch read, "Closed for emergency staff review, please stand by." News vans idled at curbs. Anchors repeated the footage from the Chicago branch lobby. The clip had been viewed 4.2 million times overnight. Inside the downtown headquarters, the air was tense. Boardroom screens flashed with live updates, HR memos, legal consultations, and a cascade of system audits unfurling like dominoes. Eleanor Harris stood before them, all sleeves rolled up, flanked by Clara Evans and Nina Patel. We are not issuing a press statement, Eleanor said firmly. We are issuing reform. But the market is rattled, one board member protested. Stock futures are dipping and they'll recover, she cut in. This isn't a scandal to be managed, it's a rot to be removed. The room fell quiet. Her words were not anger, they were certainty. Back in the Chicago branch, the shockwaves were already tearing through the old foundation. Interim leadership arrived before dawn, Lydia Grant and Marcus Tate, assigned by Eleanor herself. Together they began the process of what Marcus called controlled demolition. Their first act suspending 10 more employees across 3 departments who had pending discrimination complaints buried in HR folders. Each one had used the same language over the years, unverified, unfamiliar, atypical client profile. Patterns ignored, now they were surfacing. The internal chat logs Tara had sent were published internally to all employees. One entry from last fall read, "Some of these Southside clients think they're high value just because they walk in with a watch and a suit." Another from Kenneth, "If they don't match the client photo in your head, assume fraud first, apologize later." None of it could be spun. There was no context, just documented prejudice with a company signature at the bottom. Clara ordered a halt to all promotions pending review of past decisions. Nina Patel launched a retrospective audit of 5 years' worth of loan denials, ATM freezes, and high-risk flags. Her dashboard began lighting up in patterns she had never seen before because no one had looked. Not really. In a quiet room 4 floors above the lobby, Raymond Holt called a closed-door meeting with Horizon's general counsel and federal compliance officer. The CFPB had sent a formal notice they were watching, not to punish yet, but to verify. What Eleanor did, Raymond said quietly, may have bought us time. But time for what the attorney asked. To change before someone else forces it. Back on the branch floor, the cultural shift was no longer abstract. Staff returning to work walked past laminated posters now taped to the walls. No assumptions, no exceptions. Every client deserves full dignity, every time. If you hesitate to help someone, ask yourself why. Power isn't a badge. It's how you behave when no one's watching. Some staff scoffed. Others stared at the words longer than they expected. Even those who had not been directly implicated now felt it the weight of a system that had insulated them from consequences in the reckoning that followed. But the public wasn't waiting for Horizon to fix itself quietly. The morning talk shows lit up with discussions of financial bias. One guest, a professor from DePaul University, called it a watershed moment in modern banking accountability. By noon, 5 other banks trended on social media as former clients shared their own stories under the hashtag Withdrawal with Dignity. At a competing institution 2 blocks away, the regional director called an emergency meeting. If Horizon is burning down their biases in public, we'd better look at our walls before someone else does. Inside Horizon, Eleanor remained quiet but active. She refused interviews. She declined every TV appearance. But her silence was not absence, it was orchestration. For her, this wasn't about punishment, it was about purpose. In the staff break room, she joined frontline workers over black coffee and cold pastries, not to lecture, but to listen. A young teller asked her, "Did you ever think about quitting when they treated you like that?" Eleanor paused. "Of course. But then I remembered the whole point of a system that tries to erase you is to make you think you're alone. And you weren't," the teller asked. "I was," she admitted, "but not anymore." That afternoon, Eleanor initiated a full system reset. Every employee would be re-verified for ethics training, regardless of rank. All automated flagging systems were to be rewritten with human oversight for bias review. A client dignity hotline was launched, staffed not by customer service, but by an independent ombudsman team. And every denied client in the past 12 months would receive a written explanation apology of warranted and an invitation to re-engage with the compensation. It was bold, risky, expensive, and entirely necessary. For the first time in its history, Horizon Bank didn't lead with profit. It led with principle. And that principle had a name, one that echoed through every corridor, across every branch, in every whisper of staff, unsure whether to celebrate or retreat. Eleanor Harris hadn't just dismantled a branch. She was collapsing an entire culture and laying the foundation for something far more dangerous to injustice than anger. Accountability with teeth. 3 days later, Horizon Bank reopened quietly, without banners, without cameras. But everything was different. From the outside, the Chicago flagship branch looked unchanged. Stone columns, brass handles, frosted glass etched with the company seal. But inside it breathed a new kind of air. Gone was the icy silence that had once accompanied every denied request and whispered judgment. In its place was a purposeful hum, a rhythm of professionalism tempered by humility. The marble floors still gleamed, but now they reflected more than just ceilings. They reflected change. Eleanor Harris walked in that morning without an entourage. No press, no board, no chair beside her, just a navy wool coat, her leather-bound planner, and a silent promise to herself. Lydia Grant greeted her near the reception desk, clipboard in hand. "They're ready," she said, nodding toward the teller line. Eleanor smiled. "Let's not make it an announcement. Let's make it a standard." Across the lobby, new signage had gone up. Client dignity protocol, now in effect. Withdrawals over $10,000 require two-person review for service, not suspicion. Clients shall never be flagged without live explanation and on-record justification. Discretion is expected, dignity is mandatory. But more telling than the signs were the faces behind the glass. Tara Letteds, no longer hunched behind her monitor, stood at the teller line, shoulders upright, expression open. Her badge now had a small blue tab, Fairbank Track in Progress. It was not a mark of shame, but of accountability. She had requested the tag herself. Kenneth Doyle sat 2 rows behind, no longer in a supervisory role, but as part of the equity audit team. He answered directly to Lydia now. Every file he reviewed, every signature he confirmed was a small step in a long walk back to trust. At 9:17 a.m., the first client of the day approached the counter. She was elderly, Korean-American, wearing a green wool scarf and carrying a yellow deposit slip. Tara greeted her with a smile, and when she hesitated to speak, Tara gently lowered her voice and said, "Take your time, ma'am. I'm here." There were no sparks, no applause. Just service, clean, respectful, unburdened by bias. And somehow that was more powerful than any press release. By 10:30 a.m., the lobby began to fill. Not with spectacle, but with regular people. Some curious, others cautious. But many returning people who had once walked out feeling unseen, now watching carefully to see if the change was real. It was. The entire executive team had been rotated through sensitivity and cultural response training. No one was exempt, not even Clara Evans, who completed her final module the night before and sent Eleanor a note that simply read, "If we don't relearn the basics, we lose the right to lead." Upstairs, in what was once the glass-enclosed executive floor, new meeting rooms had been created, mixed-use, client visible, and shared with mid-tier staff. The glass was no longer frosted. Transparency was not metaphorical anymore. It was policy. At noon, a small group of young trainees gathered in one of the breakout spaces. Eleanor had requested to meet them unofficially, unscheduled. She arrived with 2 cups of coffee and sat across from a 25-year-old named Luis and a single mother named Darlene who had just finished their onboarding. "You heard the story," Eleanor said without pretense. "Now you've stepped into the place where it happened." Luis nodded. "It's different now. Everyone says it." "Does it feel different?" she asked. Darlene looked around. "It feels like I could belong here. I never thought I'd say that about a bank." Eleanor leaned back slightly. "Then we're on the right track." But it wasn't just Horizon's staff that had changed, it was their systems. All client data protocols had been restructured. Racial age and zip code-based behavior flags were retired. Biased terminology and algorithms was scrubbed and replaced with risk assessments that factored in relationship history and transaction context, not appearance. A new internal alert flashed that morning in the compliance system: high withdrawal routine verified. No override needed. That transaction had come from a Black small business owner in Bronzeville who had previously been flagged 5 times in 6 months. Today, his transaction processed in 30 seconds. Down in the break room, Marcus Tate watched it happen from his security monitor. Though semi-retired, he still came in 3 times a week, mostly to check the pulse. He sipped his coffee and chuckled. "That's what justice looks like," he muttered. Meanwhile, across town at another Horizon branch, Lydia's story had already begun to ripple. She was requested to lead a 3-month rotating mentorship program for tellers at risk of termination due to client friction. But instead of punishment, she offered them something rare: understanding. "You can't fix behavior you don't recognize," she told them. "But once you see it, you own it." By the end of the first session, 2 former skeptics had signed up for voluntary shadow shifts. One of them, Brian, was the same man who had once told a client, "We don't do walk-ins for people without appointment suits." He wore jeans to his first shadow day. At the executive level, Eleanor instituted a new bonus metric for branch leadership: not profit margin, not loan volume, but client return ratio. How many clients came back a second time, and why? Branches with high ratios would receive more autonomy, those with low ones immediate review. It was radical and refreshing. At 4:30 p.m., Eleanor returned to her office, removed her coat, and stood before the glass wall overlooking the street. She watched as people moved past the front door. Some walked in, some simply paused to read the sign. Others just passed by, unaware they were walking by a building that had once been a battleground. The place where power had been misused and then corrected. Not with rage, not with revenge, but with resolve. Tomorrow the work would begin again. But tonight something rare had taken root. A system had bent without breaking. And in its place, something better had started to grow. 3 weeks after Eleanor Harris enacted sweeping changes at the Chicago branch of Horizon Bank, the ripple effects reached further than anyone had expected, not just within the building but deep into the corporate marrow of the institution. The first structural shift wasn't a press release or a new policy. It was an email, precise, unassuming, and addressed to every department head across Horizon's national network. Subject mandatory branch equity audit schedule, Phase 1 deployment, from Clara Evans, Chief Compliance Officer, effective immediately. The message outlined a top-down inspection of every Horizon location's internal practices, employee evaluations, and customer treatment protocols. But it wasn't the audit itself that sent shockwaves. It was the audit's source code. The data had been extracted directly from Eleanor's confrontation in the Chicago branch. The logic was simple. If it happened once, it could happen again. By the following Monday, 12 senior executives had quietly submitted updated training records in an effort to preempt questions. 5 middle managers requested early retirement. 2 compliance officers resigned without notice. And yet no one said a word about Eleanor's name, not because they forgot, but because they remembered exactly who she was now. Raymond Holt, Horizon's chairman, called an emergency executive roundtable. The room was smaller than usual. Many chose not to attend in person. "I won't entertain excuses," Raymond said, eyes locked on the empty seats. "What happened in Chicago was not a misstep. It was a mirror. We ignored it before. We won't ignore it again." From his left, Clara placed a folder on the table. "These are the preliminary results from the equity pilot in Chicago. Client retention has risen 18%. First-time loan applications from minority-owned businesses have tripled. Complaint rates dropped by 31% in under a month." There was silence. Then from the end of the table, a quiet voice spoke. It was Ernest Chang, a 72-year-old executive with 40 years at the bank. "I reviewed the footage," he said, tapping a tablet in front of him. She didn't raise her voice. Not once, but somehow she raised the whole institution. Raymond gave a single nod. "From this point forward," he said, "Fairbank is no longer a pilot program. It's our operating standard. Nationally." The decision had consequences, massive ones. Branches across the country scrambled to implement compliance upgrades. Some protested. Others simply delayed. But the oversight board wasn't bluffing. 5 regional directors were demoted within a week for failure to meet initial protocol rollouts. And it wasn't just internal pressure. External scrutiny had surged. A CNN segment aired entitled "Power Prejudice," and a Withdrawal denied how one woman changed banking culture. It included cell phone footage from the lobby incident, the internal monitor displays, and Eleanor's now viral quote, "You don't fix a policy, you remove the rot." The segment ended with a quote from a former Horizon intern who tweeted, "I watched her rewrite the rules quietly, and now they're finally being read aloud." On the ground, every Horizon location received a restructuring packet titled "Client Equity from Optics to Outcome." It wasn't just a PR move. It included immediate restructuring of performance bonuses to reward inclusion metrics, system-wide freeze on automated client flagging without live verification, required review of every employee who had more than 2 bias complaints in 12 months, anonymous internal reporting channels managed by third-party auditors. Suddenly, the phrase "your account has been flagged" came under heavy legal and ethical scrutiny. Eleanor watched it all unfold from her downtown office, quiet but focused. She wasn't done. She called Marcus Tate into the room that Thursday morning. "I want your voice on the reform committee," she said. "I'm just a retired cop with a clipboard," Marcus replied. "You're a witness," she said. "That's what we need. Not just lawyers, people who see." He agreed. By Friday, Fairbank's reform committee included Marcus, Lydia Grant, Clara Evans, a rotating employee representative, and Eleanor herself. They met weekly. Every report, every concern, every request for policy clarification landed on that table. And it wasn't lip service. When the St. Louis branch failed its first audit, Eleanor didn't send a memo. She flew there. And she didn't walk through the front. She entered from the customer entrance, stood in line, and asked to speak with the manager without title, without introduction. What followed mirrored the Chicago branch weeks earlier. A pause, a furrowed brow, a skeptical glance, and then recognition. The branch manager stumbled through an apology. Eleanor didn't flinch. "You're not apologizing to me," she said. "You're apologizing to the policy you ignored." Word of that visit spread like wildfire. By the end of the month, 312 out of 347 Horizon branches had completed their initial Fairbank compliance sessions. It wasn't perfect, but it was moving, and movement was more than most had expected. Even more surprising were the letters. Hundreds arrived at Eleanor's office, some handwritten, some typed, many from communities long ignored by the banking industry. One simply said, "You looked like my mother and stood like my father. Thank you." Another read, "I closed my Horizon account 5 years ago. I'm coming back. Not for the bank, for what you made it mean." And perhaps the most striking of all came from a young intern in Albuquerque. "I didn't know who you were when I started, but after what happened, I requested to be assigned to Chicago. I want to learn where power walks softly but lands loud." The structure had changed, but it wasn't crumbling. It was rebuilding, this time with foundations made of truth. And Eleanor Harris, once dismissed, flagged, and humiliated, was now at the center of the most profound institutional shift Horizon had seen in its century-long history. While the rest of Horizon Bank scrambled to adapt to the new standards set by Fairbank, the Chicago branch remained unusually still. Still not in inactivity, but in clarity. Every corner of the branch had been touched by reform, and nowhere was the shift more palpable than in the behavior of those who once wielded silent power. Tara Leddids now sat at the far end of the operations floor, not isolated but repositioned. Her monitor displayed open compliance dashboards instead of the restricted client flagging system she once operated like a weapon. She had not been terminated. She had not been pardoned. She had been offered a mirror, and for the first time in her career, she chose to look into it. She no longer whispered behind the glass. She asked questions. She double-checked pronouns. She took notes during client meetings. And perhaps most telling of all, she listened. A young black customer walked in one Thursday morning, mid-20s navy backpack, a cautious smile. He approached her window. "I need to deposit a check," he said, "from my first consulting client. I've never done this before." Tara didn't flinch. "Congratulations," she said softly. "Let's walk through it together." He blinked, not in suspicion, but in surprise, because power had shifted, and it was showing in the smallest gestures. In the break room, Kenneth Doyle, once rigid with quiet authority, had taken up the role of internal liaison for training integration. No one had assigned him. He had volunteered after the board suspended him. His reinstatement came with no title bump, no raise, just one chance. And unlike before, he took it with humility. 2 years ago, he told the new hires, "I would have thought this was all political fluff. Now I know." It was blindness. He didn't grandstand. He didn't pretend he'd always cared. He acknowledged his absence. That morning, he reviewed a report from the Indianapolis branch, 2 flagged customer complaints for inappropriate language during account reviews. His recommendation wasn't disciplinary, it was mentoring. He requested that someone from the Chicago branch visit in person. His memo ended with a line he had never used in any official document: "Before reform must be relational, not just procedural." At headquarters, Claire Evans noticed. She shared Kenneth's memo during the board's monthly compliance review. "He's not who he was," she said, "and that's the point." Across from her, Raymond Holt nodded but remained quiet, because behind closed doors, he too had undergone a reckoning of his own. Raymond had been one of the first to promote Eleanor into upper leadership, but also one of the many who silently doubted her vision when she proposed the diversity framework years prior. He approved it, but buried it behind budget priorities. He never dismissed her outright. He just never truly believed her changes would become necessary. Until they were. And now it was Raymond who scheduled bi-weekly meetings with community financial liaisons. It was Raymond who ordered the removal of outdated client flagging algorithms that disproportionately triggered on names deemed non-traditional. It was Raymond who requested a full internal investigation into every fraud alert filed in the last 3 years, specifically those that matched Eleanor's case profile. He called it Operation Backward Mirror. What if he wrote in his report summary, "The system wasn't protecting us. It was hiding us from what we needed to see"? As the system tilted, so did public perception. Preston Ward, the once untouchable VIP client, had disappeared from every branch record. After his privileges were revoked, he attempted to sue the bank for defamation. His case was thrown out in less than a week. Judge Morton, presiding over the hearing, cited public video footage and internal audio transcripts. Your presence in that branch, she ruled, was not that of a customer, but a contributor to an environment of discrimination. Preston's name trended for a day, mostly in memes and think pieces. He became an emblem of old-world elitism losing its grip. He issued a vague apology through a spokesperson and retreated from the spotlight, and no one followed. Because his power, like the old systems, had been made irrelevant. Back in Chicago, Eleanor didn't celebrate any of it. She simply worked. She met with regional equity officers weekly. She asked tough questions. She opened her office to any employee, regardless of title. She made herself available, not visible. And her presence, more than any title, stabilized the shift. One afternoon during a branch tour in St. Paul, a junior teller asked her quietly, "Don't you ever get tired of fighting?" Eleanor smiled without warmth. "I'm not fighting," she replied. "I'm building." Outside that branch, a billboard had just gone up. Horizon Bank, where dignity is not optional. Below the slogan was a photo of a teller window, a black woman and an Asian man on opposite sides of the glass, both smiling, not staged. Captured. Real. It wasn't a marketing campaign, it was a moment, and it represented exactly what had changed. Power, once silent and assumed, was now examined and redefined. Not erased, reversed. Not just from the hands of those who abused it, but into the hands of those who would use it with care. And Eleanor Harris was no longer alone. She had never been. But now the system finally knew it too. The first board meeting under Horizon's restructured code didn't begin with applause. It began with silence. Not tense silence, not ceremonial, but intentional. At Eleanor Harris's request, every executive in the room, VPs, compliance leads, HR directors, stood for 13 seconds before sitting. 1 second for each part of the Fairbank Pledge, a new internal code developed over the past 2 weeks. 13 promises, 13 measurable behaviors, 1 unspoken truth. This time, leadership would not be inherited, it would be earned. "Let's begin," Eleanor said, taking her seat at the head of the table. The room followed. Gone were the days when title alone commanded respect. That much was clear the moment Clara Evans stood to present the new leadership realignment chart. Instead of a pyramid, the screen displayed a circle. Every department lead now shared a single ring of authority with lateral accountability lines instead of vertical chains. The CEO's name sat at the center, but smaller than the rest. "We're replacing the chain of command with what we're calling the circle of clarity," Clara explained. "Because command without clarity is control, and that's not leadership anymore." Not one executive objected, because every person in that room had witnessed what happened when clarity was absent. One by one, they leaned in. Raymond Holt, once a towering voice in strategy, now served as executive advisor emeritus. His role had shifted from decision-making to mentorship. No more signing off on branch protocols. Instead, he trained a new class of regional directors in what he called strategic empathy, the art of listening before acting. In the past, Raymond had prided himself on forecasts and performance indexes. Now he sat across from junior managers and asked questions like, "What fears are your staff not telling you? What story does your complaint data tell? What does silence mean in your branch?" He'd come full circle, not above the system, but within it. Across the table sat Nina Patel, now promoted to Chief Integrity Officer, a title Eleanor created after dissolving the old risk management division. Nina's department had one function: ensure every policy, hiring decision, and client-facing protocol aligned with the bank's public equity charter. Nina's first act: she opened a hotline not just for whistleblowers, but for idea sharing. Staff from any level could propose reforms, report blind spots, or request feedback without fear of reprisal. The hotline reports were reviewed weekly by a rotating panel of employees, not just executives. "Every voice matters," Nina said, "so every voice gets a microphone." Under her leadership, the employee satisfaction survey returned a record-breaking 82% response rate. More telling, over 200 anonymous ideas were submitted in the first 2 weeks, half of which had already been implemented. It wasn't just about being heard, it was about being believed. Elsewhere, Kenneth Doyle's name reappeared, not in disgrace, but on a task force. He had quietly requested to serve on the Reentry and Reform Integration Team, a group focused on reintegrating previously suspended or underperforming staff who completed Fairbank training. Kenneth didn't seek forgiveness. He sought structure. My past can't be rewritten, he told the panel, but I can help someone else write their future. He partnered with Clara to create a tracking system that measured behavioral change, not just attendance or pass rates. It used peer reviews, client feedback, and daily practice logs. The system had no grade, just growth. And that was the new metric of leadership at Horizon: how well you listened, how often you changed, and how deeply you served. Leadership wasn't about power anymore. It was about presence. In the Chicago branch, Lydia Grant had been quietly promoted, not to branch manager, but to equity oversight officer, a new position modeled directly after her actions that day in the lobby. Every branch now had one. Someone whose role was not to manage money or staff, but to observe culture. To ask what's not being said in this room. To say that was a microaggression, let's name it. To stand when needed and remind everyone that dignity isn't an add-on. It's the foundation. Lydia, humble as ever, kept a low profile. But her presence was felt in the smiles that lingered longer, the pauses before assumptions, and the way junior tellers looked to her not with fear, but with trust. In fact, when a new hire misgendered a client during onboarding, Lydia was the first to step in, not with reprimand, but education. "We grow together here," she said. "Let's walk through it." Her words echoed across branches. One senior VP wrote in his weekly report, "The culture used to be top-down, now it's hard-out." The transformation wasn't perfect, but it was honest. And at the center of it all stood Eleanor Still, CEO still, composed, still watching. She didn't micromanage, she didn't chase applause, she simply maintained direction. One afternoon, after reviewing a data report, she paused by the window of her office, the skyline sharp behind her. Marcus Tate, her former head of security, now a retired consultant, stood quietly beside her. He had stopped by to drop off a letter from a former client who wanted to donate to the Fairbank initiative. "Do you think they really get it now?" Marcus asked. Eleanor didn't look away from the skyline. "Not all," she replied, "but the ones who lead now do, and that's enough for today." Because leadership wasn't about titles, policies, or command. It was about the space you made for others to rise. And at Horizon Bank, that space had finally opened. The reforms didn't arrive as a press release. They arrived as a policy draft, 47 pages long, sent at 3:17 a.m. Eleanor Harris wrote it herself. No assistants, no ghostwriters, just one woman in her home office rereading transcripts from that fateful day in the lobby and reshaping them into institutional blueprints. The document was titled Fairbank Standard from Policy to Practice. Its first line, "Dignity must not be reactive, it must be designed." By sunrise, the draft was already in Clara Evans' inbox. Within 2 days, it was reviewed by the full compliance team. Within 1 week, the board had voted unanimously to implement it across all 178 Horizon branches. But Eleanor didn't stop there. Reform, she believed, was not merely internal, it had to be relational. The first section of the Fairbank Standard addressed hiring. From that day forward, Horizon's candidate review process would anonymize all identifying information in the first 2 rounds of screening. No names, no photos, no schools, just behavior-based scenarios and values-driven response scoring. It wasn't about tokenism, it was about truth, who you were when no one saw your resume. For every manager hired under this system, a reverse mentorship was mandatory. That meant senior staff had to spend 30 hours shadowing junior team members from underrepresented backgrounds, listening, not instructing. "You don't change culture from the front," Eleanor told the board. "You change it by sitting in the middle of it." The second section addressed disciplinary process. Previously, misconduct reports were filtered through branch managers, people like Margaret Clean, but now all disciplinary actions bypassed branch leadership and routed directly to a centralized ethics review panel. This panel wasn't just executives. It included 1 junior staff representative, 1 rotating community liaison, and 1 former client advocate. Together, they ensured that justice inside the bank couldn't be twisted by ego or bias. That transparency had teeth. In the first month, the ethics review panel overturned 3 prior disciplinary actions, one of which involved a teller who'd been suspended for tone while correcting a client's racial slur. He was reinstated with back pay and a personal apology from senior leadership. But perhaps the boldest reform lay in the way Horizon now measured success. Under the old model, performance reviews focused on numbers, accounts, opened loans, closed product upsells. Under the Fairbank Standard, those metrics were halved. The other half now came from community engagement bias, interruption logs, and client dignity reports. Staff who once skimmed through compliance training now had to prove not just what they knew, but how they acted. A teller who de-escalated a racially charged encounter received the same commendation as one who secured a major client deposit. It was radical, and it worked. In Horizon's Midwest region, customer retention jumped by 11% in a single quarter. Branches once considered problematic showed a measurable drop in internal complaints. And the clients noticed. One afternoon in Indianapolis, a Burmese refugee named Tinong walked into a Horizon branch holding an envelope of cash, his first savings in America. When he hesitated at the front desk, unsure of the process, the teller didn't wave him off or call security. She walked around the counter and sat beside him. She used a laminated visual aid, written in 5 languages, and guided him through every step without rushing. At the end, Tin smiled. "Feels safe," he said. That branch logged his comment as a dignity win under the new tracking system. And across the country, those wins were being tracked like revenue. Even advertising changed. Gone were the glossy posters of elite clients on yachts. In their place were real stories. A veteran rebuilding credit, a single mother opening her first savings account, a high school student launching a scholarship fund. Horizon no longer sold exclusivity, it sold possibility. But reform wasn't easy. There were pushbacks. Some executives balked at the speed of change. One senior VP complained privately that the new empathy metrics were too soft. He was invited to spend a week working anonymously at a branch counter. Eleanor called it immersion insight. He returned with a 14-page report and a quiet apology. "This isn't soft," he told the board. "This is structural." Another manager tried to bypass the ethics panel to discipline a transgender employee for dress code violation. The complaint was flagged, escalated, and resolved with policy clarification, and the manager was placed on retraining. Word spread fast. The system wasn't just new, it had teeth. But reform didn't mean punishment. It meant preparation. Every employee received a bias toolkit, a simple binder with practical guides. How to interrupt harmful language, how to check assumptions, how to respond with empathy. At first, some scoffed. But when a young teller used one of the scripts to de-escalate a potential conflict between 2 customers, even the skeptics noticed. She didn't shout, she didn't shame, she asked a single question. "Would you say that if your child were watching?" Silence, then calm. Reform, Eleanor believed, was a series of small hinges that opened big doors. 6 weeks after Fairbank launched, she hosted the first all-hands listening call. No agenda, no speeches, just listening. Over 2,000 employees joined. Some cried, some apologized, some suggested ideas that were instantly approved. By the end, Eleanor said just one thing: "Thank you for helping me see what I couldn't alone." That was the heart of institutional reform, not control, not compliance, but collective correction. Because institutions don't change when leaders give commands. They change when leaders give permission for everyone to lead. The first sign of awakening didn't come from a newspaper or news anchor. It came from a handwritten note taped to the front window of Horizon Bank's Chicago branch. It read, "To Ms. Harris, thank you for standing tall so the rest of us could finally stand too. Rosa W., retired school teacher." By noon, there were 7 more. By the next morning, over 50. People didn't knock, they didn't march. They simply walked by, read the note, and left their own. A young delivery driver scribbled on a sandwich wrapper, "I watched the whole thing on TikTok. You made me believe again." A nurse still in scrubs posted, "We've been waiting for someone to say what you did, and you said it without yelling. That matters." Within 3 days, local newspapers picked up the story not just of Eleanor's confrontation, but of what followed. Reform wasn't the headline anymore. Respect was, and it spread faster than anyone expected. One retired judge wrote an op-ed, "In 30 years on the bench, I've rarely seen someone dismantle systemic bias in real time and then rebuild the structure by morning." Eleanor Harris didn't just fire a manager, she fired up a movement. On social media, clips from the bank lobby circulated globally. Fairbank moment trended on Twitter, followed by "Dignity is not optional." Even people who had never stepped foot in a Horizon branch felt the ripple. A podcast host in Detroit dedicated an episode to it. A teacher in Atlanta used the lobby video as a case study on ethics. A barbershop in Oakland printed out quotes from Eleanor's speech and taped them to their mirror. And then came the letters. From veterans who had been denied loans, from immigrants who had been talked down to, from students who had been ignored in business classes. They weren't angry letters. They were grateful. One simply read, "You didn't flinch, so now I won't either." In Des Moines, Iowa, a local artist created a mural across from the town's smallest Horizon branch. It featured a faceless woman in a teal coat, her posture upright, a phone in one hand and truth glowing from the other. Beneath it, justice doesn't always shout. Sometimes it just shows up. But it wasn't just artists and activists. Clients came back. Clients who had quietly left Horizon returned to their branches and reopened accounts not because of promotions, but because of principle. One woman, a retired military officer, walked into a Texas branch and said, "I didn't come for the rates. I came because I saw the video. I want a bank somewhere where they let Black women lead." The staff stood still for a moment, then guided her to the desk in silence, a bit stunned by what their institution had become. The New York Times ran a Sunday cover story titled, "How One Woman in a Bank Lobby Rewrote Corporate America's Rules." It wasn't hyperbole. Industry insiders confirmed Horizon's spike in applications for entry-level positions. But more surprisingly, competitors began issuing internal reviews, some quietly, some publicly. A banking executive in Philadelphia admitted on record, "What Harris did in 7 minutes, we failed to do in 7 years." But the real awakening wasn't in headlines. It was in whispers turning into conversation. In school board meetings where parents asked, "Are we tracking bias the way Horizon does now?" In PTA meetings where a mother asked, "Why don't we post dignity ratings too?" In churches and barbershops and buses and bakeries where someone would pause mid-conversation and say, "Did you see that CEO?" Not because she was a celebrity, but because she was familiar. She looked like someone's aunt. She sounded like someone's mother. She walked like someone who had had enough and finally did something. Eleanor's staff didn't issue press kits. There was no marketing push, no viral campaign team, just action and accountability. In one Brooklyn cafe, a chalkboard outside the door read, "Today's special, tell the truth. Even when it's quiet, even when it's hard." That's when the news coverage shifted. No longer just a bank story. It was a human one. Journalists visited the Chicago branch daily hoping to catch a glimpse of Eleanor. Most didn't. She didn't linger for applause. She stayed in motion building. One day she did stop for a student reporter from a community college paper. A young Black woman in oversized glasses asked, "What do you hope changes most?" Eleanor thought for a long moment, then replied, "The moment we stop asking who someone is before we decide if they matter, that's when we've changed." The quote ended up on posters, mugs, even street signs. But that wasn't what Eleanor remembered most. What stayed with her was a voicemail, left at 2:12 a.m. by a single father in Denver. "I was going to close my account. Figured all banks were the same. But after what I saw, I stayed. Not for me, for my daughter, because if she ever walks into a place and gets looked at like you did, I want her to remember how you stood." Public awakening didn't look like a parade. It looked like a pause. A pause before someone dismissed another person at a counter. A pause before someone labeled a client suspicious. A pause before silence became complicity. And in that pause, a new kind of banking began. Not just deposits and withdrawals, but restoration of trust, of dignity, of belief. It started with a whisper at a quarterly summit in San Francisco. Did you hear what Horizon did? Not just the firing, not just the speech, the system. Fairbank was the name floating across coffee breaks and boardrooms. At first it was curiosity, then discomfort, then urgency. By the end of that week, 3 regional banks reached out to Horizon Bank's compliance team, requesting informal overviews of Eleanor Harris's reform model. No legal contracts, no partnerships, just questions. How did you track real-time training? How did you vet bias complaints without internal leaks? How did you enforce dignity without lawsuit? The answer came not from lawyers, but from Eleanor herself. She published a 9-page white paper titled, "Silent Systems Rebuilding Respect Without a Scandal." The document didn't shame, it didn't name names, it simply outlined the core structure of Fairbank. Real-time compliance dashboards visible to both staff and clients. Anonymous incident reporting tied to equity audit response within 72 hours. A dignity assurance protocol every teller must complete 2 empathy simulations per month. Public-facing training completion rates displayed at each branch. Banks in Seattle, Dallas, and Raleigh adopted the model within 30 days. But it was the insurance companies that really shifted. One firm, United Allied, quietly introduced a new premium discount for institutions with verified bias reform frameworks modeled after Horizon's. Their actuarial team cited lower reputational risk and higher client retention through cultural trust. It stunned the industry because now dignity had a dollar value. Suddenly, banks weren't just talking compliance. They were running numbers. A mid-sized credit union in Minnesota published an internal memo. We stand to lose 8.2 Ms annually in client churn without a cultural restructuring strategy. Fairbank became a keyword. In boardrooms, in quarterly goals, in job postings, bias certified, culture preferred. But Eleanor didn't monetize it. She didn't license it. She shared it. On one condition in quarterly public equity reports. If you wanted the framework, you had to let your clients see your work. Transparency wasn't a feature, it was the fee. Many declined. But the ones that accepted saw what Horizon had seen. Customers didn't want perfect institutions. They wanted accountable ones. The dominoes kept falling. A private bank in Manhattan launched an internal listening series inviting frontline staff to speak directly to executives. A Black regional manager in Charlotte cited Eleanor's lobby video during a presentation on systemic onboarding bias and was later promoted to VP of Talent Culture. 3 financial podcasts created a series titled The Fairbank Era: Redefining Service in the Wake of Silence. But it wasn't just the banking world. Law firms began citing Horizon's HR response model in employee lawsuits as a benchmark for how discrimination should be handled. An Ivy League business school redesigned its ethics curriculum, naming the updated course Power Policy and the Eleanor Principle. Even corporate America's largest consulting firm, Drexler & Partners, issued an internal reform challenge to its clients: meet Horizon's transparency standard by Q3 or be listed as laggards. That got attention. Suddenly, corporate leaders were holding emergency retreats not on quarterly profits, but on cultural temperature. In one viral clip, a CEO from a multinational firm said on camera, "We're not afraid of the Eleanor Harris story. We're afraid of the cameras being on us when our story unfolds the same way." It was a reckoning, but it wasn't angry. It was precise, surgical. Exactly how Eleanor had moved from the teller line to the boardroom. Back at Horizon, she watched the movement ripple but didn't bask in it. She scheduled another round of anonymous town halls. She updated the bias dashboard UX so it was easier to read. She added a new branch-level dignity role called Civic Liaison, designed to bring local community voices into corporate feedback loops. Meanwhile, Nina Patel, now known across the industry as the Enforcer, held weekly cross-institutional calls to help other HR departments adopt the Horizon method. Every week, more joined. Every week, more asked, "How did you make people care?" And Nina's answer was always the same. "We didn't ask them to care. We made it visible when they didn't." That's when the government took notice. The Consumer Financial Protection Bureau launched an initiative called Banks of Belonging. To qualify, institutions had to prove transparent handling of internal bias complaints, display cultural audit outcomes in public-facing platforms, integrate community leadership into training development. Horizon Bank was named the flagship model. Eleanor declined a White House photo op. She said this wasn't a campaign, it was a correction. But the photograph still appeared: Eleanor seated at a long policy table, head tilted, not posing but listening. That image would be printed in business textbooks a year later, beneath the caption, "Leadership is not just what you build, it's what you're willing to fix." Back at the Chicago branch, no one spoke of the past in whispers anymore. Clients knew the story. Employees felt it in their training, their policies, their posture. A janitor on night shift once said, "We don't just clean floors here, we clear pathways." And maybe that's what industry echoes really were. Not copies, but consequences. A wave that starts as resistance and rolls out as reform. Because when one bank lobby became a national mirror, every institution had to ask, what would we have done if she stood here? And better yet, what will we do before she ever has to? It happened quietly, as most turning points do. A Freedom of Information Act request filed by an independent journalist from the Equity Ledger triggered a chain reaction no one at Horizon expected. What began as a background inquiry into outdated complaint logs became the unraveling of a cover-up, one that predated even Eleanor's tenure as CEO. The reporter, a soft-spoken graduate named Daniel Cho, had been following the Horizon story since Eleanor's standoff went viral. While others chased headlines, he traced filings, internal memos, compliance flags, and archived HR reports buried under layers of outdated systems. And there it was. A flagged 2013 incident marked no violation found. The report described a teller at Horizon's Detroit branch denying service to a disabled Black veteran attempting to cash a government check. The complaint had been signed by a junior employee, none other than a young Lydia Grant. At the time, it had been swept under procedural miscommunication, closed with no follow-up. Until now. Daniel traced it further back to an internal review led by Kenneth Doyle. The digital signature was unmistakable. He brought the finding to Horizon's public liaison inbox with a simple subject line, unanswered history, still want the truth. Within 72 hours, Eleanor had the full file on her desk. She read it once, then again, then sat back in silence. This wasn't about reliving the past. It was about exposing the rot that had lingered tolerated in the foundation long before cameras ever entered a lobby. She called Clara Evans. "I need to bring something forward," she said. Clara's voice didn't waver. "Then let's prepare the floor." Eleanor didn't go to the press. She went to the board. In a closed-door meeting, she presented Daniel's findings, Lydia's original complaint, and the digital trail showing Kenneth's suppression. The board was stunned. Raymond Holt spoke first. "Why now?" Eleanor replied evenly. "Because exposure doesn't end when the cameras leave. It ends when the patterns are broken." Clara added, "And if we don't break them ourselves, someone else will for a price." The board voted unanimously Horizon would reopen every flagged complaint from 2010 to 2020 involving discrimination, bias, or misconduct. All 178 of them. But Eleanor went further. She announced the creation of a historical reconciliation task force, an independent body including community leaders, former clients, and retired employees to investigate unresolved past incidents. "We cannot preach accountability," she said at the internal announcement, "unless we are brave enough to hold a mirror to what was overlooked before." The news broke 2 days later. Horizon Bank opens archives. A decade of complaints to be reviewed by civil panel. It hit like a shockwave. Other banks had rushed to implement surface-level reforms, diversity panels, awareness campaigns, but none had dared to walk backward. To ask, who did we silence? Eleanor's move was hailed as the most radical act of corporate transparency in modern banking. And then came the fallout. Kenneth Doyle, already suspended and under review, faced an internal ethics tribunal. His record showed 3 separate instances over 9 years where complaints were closed without action despite evidence. He had cited reputation risk and client status as mitigating factors. He was terminated effective immediately. His final statement read simply, "I thought I was protecting the bank. I now realize I was protecting the rot." The veteran from the 2013 incident was located. His name was Richard T. Mosley. He was 76 years old and still banking locally, unaware his file had been archived under a false summary. Eleanor called him personally. "Mr. Mosley," she said, "I can't undo what was ignored, but I can make sure it's not buried again." Horizon issued a formal apology, and Eleanor invited him to speak at the launch of the Reconciliation Task Force. His words were measured, almost quiet. "All I wanted that day," he said to the room, "was to be treated like I mattered. Not because I served, just because I was human." The room stood in silence. Later that month, Daniel Cho published his full investigative report, Buried Systems, The Cost of Silence at Horizon Bank. It didn't cast Horizon as villains. It cast them as a case study in what it means to face truth with integrity. The article trended on LinkedIn and was used in training seminars across 10 Fortune 500 companies within the quarter. Eleanor never once mentioned Daniel publicly. She didn't need to. She sent him a handwritten note instead. "History doesn't change itself. People do. Thank you for holding the mirror." But the final exposure didn't stop there. A deeper audit into Horizon's third-party vendor contracts revealed that several of their security contractors had histories of racial profiling, complaints, patterns missed or ignored due to lax vetting procedures. Eleanor ordered all contracts frozen pending review. Over 40 vendors were reevaluated. 11 were permanently terminated. In their place, Horizon implemented a new vendor protocol. Every future partner must meet the same dignity compliance standard as internal staff. The financial world took note again. It was no longer about just the people inside Horizon. It was about everyone they worked with. The exposure wasn't a threat. It was a principle. If we touch it, we vet it. From compliance partners to janitorial services, Horizon expanded its accountability to every corner of its influence. Clients noticed. New applications surged. Former clients returned. Because the exposure had done what no ad campaign ever could, it made people believe again. Not in perfection, but in a system willing to admit it had been wrong and prove it with action. And Eleanor, she didn't need a spotlight. Just enough light to show where the cracks had been, and the courage to keep revealing what others had tried so hard to bury. The headlines faded, the protests quieted, the think pieces were archived. But inside Horizon Bank, the change kept moving. There were no grand speeches now, no viral videos, no thunderclaps of public shame. What came instead were policies written in silence, Hallways reorganized without fanfare and decisions made with the deliberate weight of those who understood that true justice doesn't announce itself. It simply arrives. Eleanor Harris never called it a victory, but others did. 3 weeks after the Reconciliation Task Force was announced, the first outreach letters went out to clients whose complaints had been dismissed over the past decade. Some came back with silence, some came with outrage, and some came with tears, but nearly all came back. In one branch, a Somali refugee who'd been denied account access due to insufficient documentation returned with the same ID he'd presented 8 years prior. This time, he left with a checking account, a business savings plan, and a thank you card from the teller. In another, a retired factory worker walked in to close her account in protest. But when she saw the equity compliance dashboard now displayed openly behind the counter, she paused. She asked to speak to the branch manager, not to complain, but to say, "I've never seen a bank apologize before. You've earned another chance." And in Chicago, where it had all started, Lydia Grant sat quietly in her new office, now regional equity officer, reviewing a complaint about a teller who allegedly ignored a Latina customer's questions about credit options. She didn't delay. She didn't deflect. She called the client herself, listened, reviewed the footage, and within an hour had initiated coaching and bias retraining for the employee. "Don't bury the small moments," Eleanor had told her once. "They're the bricks of bigger things." At headquarters, Nina Patel began rolling out a series of confidential surveys, a design not for compliance but for truth. Questions like, "Have you ever felt dismissed because of who you are?" replaced the outdated. "How satisfied were you with your service today?" The answers were raw and often painful. But Eleanor didn't flinch. She read every summary. She sent thank you notes to employees who submitted anonymous insights. And she added one question of her own. "What would fairness feel like to you?" In the quiet corners of break rooms and beneath the polished hush of boardrooms, employees began to whisper about the new horizon. Not as a slogan, but as a feeling. It showed up when Kenneth Doyle, once suspended for negligence, asked a junior team to teach him how to flag discriminatory patterns in onboarding interviews. It showed when Tara, now halfway through her reform track, mentored a new black teller through her first week, not with performative cheer, but with quiet, earned humility. And it showed when Eleanor passed through branches unannounced, sitting in waiting areas beside customers and asking them directly, "Did you feel seen today?" There was no script, just a notebook and a pen. Some didn't recognize her. Others did and froze, unsure what to say. But Eleanor always smiled and said the same thing. "You don't need to impress me. You just need to tell me the truth." Word spread. Not the kind of word that goes viral, but the kind that spreads slowly in community groups, in churches, and corner barbershops. Horizon wasn't just trying to fix its image, it was changing its spirit. At an internal town hall 6 weeks later, Marcus Tate, the former head of security, now retired, was invited to speak. He declined at first, said he didn't want a spotlight. But when Eleanor personally called and said, "You saw what others looked away from," he agreed. He stood at the podium, no suit, no slideshow, just a folder in hand. "I was a cop for 30 years, he said. "I know what silence looks like. I know what cover-up smells like. And I know what change feels like." He paused. "This place feels different now." He opened the folder and read a quote one he'd copied down from Eleanor during that infamous day in the lobby. "Justice doesn't always knock. Sometimes it walks in and waits to be seen." The room was still. Then came applause. Not thunderous, but knowing. That same week, Eleanor received a package from the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. Inside wasn't a fine, it was a certificate. Award of Integrity in recognition of systemic transparency and ethical restoration. Eleanor didn't display it. She tucked it away in the same drawer where she kept the original falsified fraud report, opposite sides of the same war. Her war. Quiet. Relentless. One not with noise, but with truth. That weekend, she walked into a branch in Detroit, the one where the 2013 incident had occurred. The lobby was different now. Brighter, more open. A sign above the counter read, "We see you, we serve you." A young teller, no older than 22, looked up and said, "Good morning. How can I help?" Eleanor didn't announce who she was. She handed over a withdrawal slip and ID, waited. The teller smiled and said, "Everything checks out. Would you like that in hundreds or 50s? Eleanor smiled back. "50s, please, it's for a donation." She took the envelope, nodded once, and left. No camera followed, no announcement made. But in that quiet transaction, with no friction, no assumption, and no delay, The victory was complete. Not loud, not dramatic, but real and irreversible. 3 months after the reckoning at Horizon Bank, the ripple effects began surfacing not just in branches or boardrooms, but across the entire banking industry. It started with the Fair Bank model. Banks from Seattle to Miami sent delegates to Chicago to observe the new compliance programs Eleanor Harris had pioneered. At first, some executives scoffed. Diversity charters, live bias workshops, public accountability, dashboards. These sounded like PR stunts or overcorrections. But when they saw the numbers, the tone changed. Customer retention was up 18%, employee turnover down 22%. Quarterly trust ratings, a metric long thought immeasurable, had reached the highest levels in Horizon's history. Then came the media. What began as a viral lobby video turned into a 6-part investigative series in the Financial Chronicle, chronicling Eleanor's journey from compliance analyst to the bank's first Black female CEO. The series wasn't just about the incident. It was about endurance, integrity, quiet leadership. It was titled "The Woman Who Changed How Banks Listen." Within weeks, academic institutions requested permission to turn Horizon's internal crisis into case studies. Harvard, Wharton, Stanford, even HBCUs like Howard and Spelman. Eleanor approved every request with one caveat: the narrative must include the parts where she was ignored, humiliated, and assumed powerless. The transformation only matters, she told one dean, if you understand what it cost. At Horizon itself, new rituals emerged, none of them mandated, all of them organic. Some tellers began keeping a note card by their stations that read, "Check your tone and your assumptions." Supervisors started equity huddles before morning shifts, 5-minute meetings to discuss customer empathy and internal support. Even corporate training began with a video of Lydia Grant sitting in the same lobby chair where she had once watched injustice unfold in silence. She didn't dramatize the moment. She just spoke plainly. "I saw it happen, and I knew it was wrong, but I thought I didn't have the right to stop it. I do now, and so do you." The impact extended far beyond bank walls. City councils began citing Horizon as a community model. A bipartisan delegation in Congress requested Eleanor's presence at a private financial ethics roundtable. She declined the spotlight, but she sent documentation, statistics, in an opening line that cut straight to the heart. When your systems protect assumptions more than people, reform isn't optional, it's overdue. The most unexpected echo came from within a rival institution. Clarendon Financial, long considered the more elite competitor, quietly reached out. Their internal audits had surfaced patterns of exclusion similar to Horizon's before its collapse. They didn't ask for branding advice. They asked for help. Eleanor sent a small team, not PR, not marketing. She sent 3 people: Lydia Terra, now near completion of her reform track, and Kenneth Doyle. Their task: not to preach, not to sell, just to listen. And that changed everything. In her own branches, Eleanor kept moving quietly. She stopped by break rooms, asked for names, birthdays, favorite snacks. She sat with janitorial staff and asked what they'd change if they were CEO for a day. She made every suggestion count, whether it was new vending options or new complaint intake systems. To Eleanor, legacy was never about monuments. It was about small systems made honest. In Atlanta, one young intern named Caleb Garcia posted a photo of a handwritten note Eleanor had left him after observing his service with a nervous elderly couple. The note read, "Kindness is strategy. You did both. Well done." The post went viral on LinkedIn. Not for the fame, but because in an industry used to cold metrics and polished veneers, the warmth was shocking. By summer, Horizon launched the Equity in Motion initiative, a mobile branch unit staffed by multilingual tellers, driving into neighborhoods long underserved by banking infrastructure. At its ribbon cutting, Eleanor didn't speak. Instead, she asked Marcus Tate, now officially retired, to stand beside the van and share one lesson. He chose 5 words: watch, listen, speak, then change. The crowd clapped. No orchestra, no media wall, just truth. Meanwhile, Tara Lettids had begun mentoring young recruits. She never hid her story. In fact, she opened every workshop with it. "I made assumptions," she said. "I thought I could hide behind policy. But policy is only as just as the people who enforce it." Kenneth, once buried in ego, now taught internal modules titled Unlearning Superiority. He didn't flinch when questions came. He answered them all. One employee asked, "What changed you?" He looked down, seeing someone stand still and still be more powerful than all of us shouting. And what of Margaret Clean? Her name never returned to Horizon directories. But one day, a donation slip landed on the CEO's desk. A contribution to the Fairbank Foundation, a small check unsigned except for the words, "Thank you for the mirror." Eleanor didn't respond. She didn't need to. By fall, Horizon's annual report contained a new section, Restoration Metrics. It detailed every instance of community correction, every policy shift triggered by client feedback, and every branch audit result. It ended with a line penned by Eleanor herself. "We were wrong, but we changed, and we are not done." That fall, Horizon's stock value hit a record high. But the numbers weren't what mattered most. What mattered were the small signs taped near every teller station in Chicago. They were just 3 words, simple, firm, and quietly revolutionary. Dignity. Every time. The morning sun filtered gently through the tall windows of Horizon Bank's national headquarters. On the 17th floor, the boardroom stood quiet, no murmurs, no urgent calls. Just silence as Eleanor Harris stood facing the wall of photos honoring past executives. She wasn't there to admire portraits. She was reviewing legacy. Not of individuals, but of decisions. Behind her, the chair she never quite got used to, too soft, too ornate, sat untouched. She preferred the standing table by the window where she often jotted thoughts on legal pads instead of tablets. That morning, she wrote 4 words, "Never again without voice." It had been 6 months since the lobby incident. Enough time for the media wave to fade, enough distance for memory to distort. But she didn't allow distortion. Every detail had been recorded, reviewed, and absorbed, not to dwell, but to ensure that dignity didn't slip back into theory. The reforms had taken root. Fairbank was now embedded in Horizon's core systems. It wasn't a program anymore. It was policy. From teller orientation to executive onboarding, every employee was now evaluated not just on performance, but on presence, how they treated clients, how they listened, how they assumed less and asked more. But Eleanor knew something deeper had shifted. Not just systems, culture. There were no press releases about that. No social media carousels. Just small changes. Fewer escalations from lower-income branches. More handwritten client feedback in native languages, a sudden uptick in promotion applications from long-overlooked staff. That was how she measured progress. Still, she didn't mistake progress for perfection. Every week, she reviewed audit summaries with Clara Evans and Nina Patel. Every quarter, she requested raw transcripts from the anonymous feedback hotline. And every time she read something uncomfortable, she responded not with defensiveness, but with a question: what are we still not hearing? Justice, she often said, isn't a moment. It's a habit. That philosophy caught the attention of the Federal Financial Integrity Commission. In a private letter, they requested her guidance on structuring national frameworks for institutional ethics reporting. She declined to sit on the advisory board, but she sent her full blueprint, no edits, no redactions. In a handwritten note, she included a postscript: don't build systems for optics. Build them for accountability. The message landed. By the end of the fiscal year, 4 major banks had adopted aspects of the Fairbank model. One of them, a firm with a notorious history of redlining, sent a delegation to Horizon for observation. They arrived in suits, skeptical and stiff. They left humbled, shaken, and strangely hopeful. It was Lydia Grant who hosted them. She didn't need charts. She simply shared the story of a day when she chose silence and how she'd never do that again. The delegation applauded, but more importantly, they listened. Meanwhile, Kenneth Doyle submitted a 110-page proposal for bias intervention training in high net worth account handling. It was approved without hesitation. He now oversaw a team focused exclusively on identifying invisible inequities in policy. Tara Letteds, once near dismissal, became Horizon's most requested peer mentor. She didn't perform humility, she practiced it. She often quoted Eleanor to new hires: "Your job is not to enforce power, it's to protect dignity." And what of Eleanor herself? She never issued a public resignation or staged a triumphant farewell. She simply began visiting branches unannounced, not to inspect, but to observe, to sit in waiting areas, to watch how long someone like her, older, black, unassuming, would wait to be treated with care. She timed it. She took notes. And sometimes she left a folded card for a teller who did it right. The card said simply, "I saw you." Legacy, she believed, wasn't in titles. It was in how you moved when the camera stopped rolling. Outside Horizon industry publications wrote glowing pieces about her. One headline read, "The woman who made respect a requirement." Another simply said, "She didn't yell, she led." But Eleanor rarely engaged with them. Her attention was elsewhere, on the clients who now walked into branches without fear, on the young black girls who came to shadow tellers during school break, on the elderly Latina woman who sent a thank you note because for the first time in decades she said a bank made me feel safe. Eleanor kept that note in her top drawer, not as proof of success but as motivation, because she knew the work wasn't done. She had one final project. She collaborated with community leaders to create the Dignity Fellowship, an annual scholarship and mentorship program for first-generation professionals in finance and ethics. It was funded privately, no fanfare, only a guiding principle. Let the ones who were once denied build the systems that never deny. On the day of the fellowship's launch, Eleanor gave a short speech in the courtyard of Horizon's flagship branch. "I'm not here as your CEO today," she said, voice steady. "I'm here as someone who was once told I didn't belong in the very place I helped build." She paused. "And I stayed. Not for revenge, but for repair." The crowd applauded. A journalist asked her afterward what she wanted people to take from her story. She smiled. "That justice is quiet work," she said. "It looks like showing up, asking better questions, and not waiting for a title to act." As the sun dipped behind the skyscrapers, Eleanor walked down the front steps. No cameras, no entourage. Just a woman with purpose, heading into a world that finally, at least in part, was learning to listen. If you found this story powerful, subscribe to Real Life Stories New for more narratives that expose injustice and celebrate quiet revolutions.